So you did run on a platform. You were very straightforward. You said you would pardon these people that were sentenced for January 6th.
Yeah, totally.
You did. The only criticism or pushback I've seen is about people that were convicted or involved in incidents where they were violent with police. Why did they get a pardon?
A number of reasons. Number one, they were in there for 3.5 years, a long time.
Right.
And in many solitary confinement, treated like nobody's ever been treated. It's treated so badly. They were treated like the worst criminals in history. And you know what they were there for? They were protesting the vote.
So what you just saw right there was Sean Hannity actually pressing President Trump on why certain January 6 rioters also received pardons, even if they were actually convicted, and on video, by the way, attacking police officers on that particular day. And President Trump ends up responding to him. He ends up saying, look, a lot of these people did serve time in jail, and also later on we find out that he didn't want to go through 1,500 individual cases, which honestly is a bit ridiculous, but essentially the point that he's trying to make is like, look, these people served their time, they were protesting an election that President Trump maintains is rigged, therefore, that is why he gave blanket pardons to even people convicted of violent crimes. Now, of course, on this channel, we have talked about rioting, escaping consequences for rioting, and how not only have Black Lives Matter rioters who rioted all throughout 2020, caused billions of dollars in damage, escaped those consequences, but in many jurisdictions, they ended up receiving payouts from places like New York City, from Philadelphia, and so on and so forth. But the fact of the matter is, just because something wrong happened in that particular category doesn't mean that this is inherently acceptable or inherently good. And just because Joe Biden commuted the sentences of people who murdered FBI agents, like that Native American activist who he let out of prison, among other criminals that Biden let off the hook, doesn't excuse Trump for doing the same, and by the way, won't excuse him from the consequences of his actions. And that's what I want to talk about today, because again, I understand that this is definitely 100% a promises made, promises kept kind of moment, and I understand exactly why President Trump decided to follow through on said promises, but that doesn't mean that this is a policy that I'm 100% in agreement with, and I actually appreciate Sean Hannity for asking him the question in the moment, because Sean Hannity is largely viewed as a Trump lapdog. That being said, before we get into this, I want to remind you that my friend Devin Tracy, his parents lost their home in the California wildfires. He has started a GoFundMe in order to raise money to help them get back on their feet. So if you can donate, please do. If you can't, I understand. If you don't want to, I understand. I'm just trying to help a friend.
A number of reasons. Number one, they were in there for 3.5 years, a long time.
Right.
And in many solitary confinement, treated like nobody's ever been treated. It's treated so badly. They were treated like the worst criminals in history. And you know what they were there for? They were protesting the vote because they knew the election was rigged, and they were protesting the vote. And that you should be allowed to protest the vote. You should be allowed to. You know, when the day comes,
you shouldn't be able to invade the Capitol.
No, ready? Most of the people were absolutely innocent. Okay, but forgetting all about that, these people have served horribly a long time. It would be very, very cumbersome to go and look. You know how many people we're talking about? 1,500 people. Almost all of them should not have been. This should not have happened. And the other thing is this: some of those people with the police, true, but they were very minor incidents. Okay, you know they get built up by that a couple of fake guys that are on CNN all the time.
Nobody watches.
They were very minor incidents, and it was time.
So like I said in the open of this video, in terms of President Trump issuing these pardons, it definitely falls in the category of promises made, promises kept. So I understand why a lot of people are definitely in support of this. I understand why most of the January 6th defendants should receive some kind of clemency and or pardons, because in reality, what they ultimately ended up doing was trespassing, and a lot of those trespassing charges and a lot of the other charges were escalated to the point where they got terrorism enhancements that were wildly inappropriate, and even some federal courts have said that they were wildly inappropriate. In addition to that, Matt Christensen has documented in a couple of his videos how people ended up pleading guilty to certain crimes while the federal prosecutors were withholding evidence under a national security excuse, which is in fact a Brady violation. So in those cases, let us be clear, I am unambiguous with my support of clemency and or pardons, again, depending on the circumstances. However, we need to understand the difference. Clemency is mercy. So Stuart Rhodes, the founder of the Oath Keepers, he ended up getting clemency from President Trump. He did not actually get a full pardon. So the conviction and whatnot is still on his record. He was just shown mercy by the President of the United States. A pardon wipes your record clean from that particular crime. And by the way, I do want to point something out that is not getting reported by all the January 6th hysterics out there, and that is the fact that President Trump limited the scope of these pardons to the actions on January 6th specifically, and of course the things related to that. And the reason why that is absolutely crucial is because we saw earlier in the day, and of course with the Hunter Biden pardon, Biden give people a 10-year window in which they are not prosecutable for any federal crime at all whatsoever. So those were basically limitless by comparison, but that doesn't mean that certain people who engaged in violence against police should have gotten those pardons. And again, I understand if you disagree, I understand if you're like promises made, promises kept, but the fact of the matter is some of these individuals will likely, because of their violent history before January 6th and the violence that they committed on January 6th, will go on to commit violent crimes in society. And what kind of person would I be if I railed against people like Alvin Bragg? I railed against New York State bail reform. I railed against policies in California and all these different left-wing cities if I excuse that for known to be violent people just because they happen to have also been violent on January 6th. And a perfect example of this is a man called Daniel Charles Ball, who prosecutors alleged threw an explosive device at officers in a tunnel at the Capitol and was arrested for this and was actually awaiting trial, so he did not serve time for this particular crime at the time that he received his pardon. Now, to be clear, Daniel Charles Ball is the guy who was rearrested, which we will touch on in a little bit, and going through these different various articles, it's actually unclear what they mean by explosive device thrown in there, and it could have been as something as simple as throwing a tear gas canister or some kind of canister that law enforcement threw in their direction back in the direction of law enforcement, or a firework or something of the sort. And in fact, even the indictment says that they don't understand whether or not this was a manufactured device or a homemade device. So let's be clear about that, because this particular crime is alleged at this moment in time, or was alleged. He was never convicted of it. And obviously that is not the issue at hand. That case could have played out in the court. I understand that people have issues with the DC courts. It is obviously overwhelmingly Democrat. It's probably one of the only places in the entire country that moved more toward the Democratic Party in the 2024 election. And the jurors have shown a willingness to convict grandmas that were just walking through of trespassing with terrorism enhancements and all sorts of crazy things that we've seen related to the January 6th investigation, which, by the way, was the largest investigation in American history. And I will remind you that Antifa rioters who attacked the White House were not prosecuted in this way. That Antifa rioters that attacked a federal courthouse in Portland were not prosecuted this way. And this is not just at the state and local level, it was at the federal level. But the reason I'm highlighting this individual, and the reason you're seeing a lot of people highlight this, is because this guy was rearrested due to the fact that he had a federal gun charge, a federal violation, because he was already a convicted felon at the time that he received this pardon from President Trump. So the gun charges against Ball actually arose after authorities said that they found firearms and ammunition in his possession while they were executing a search warrant related to January 6th. His attorney, Amy Collins, told the Washington Post. Prosecutors argued in an August 2024 indictment that Ball is not allowed to possess weapons given prior convictions unrelated to the Capitol attack. The gun charges raise questions about how broadly the president's act of clemency applies. Collins told The Guardian that her client will fight the charges, arguing that they were connected to the federal prosecutors on the January 6th investigation and therefore are covered under the pardon. Now, this is where things get particularly interesting in this case, because you have an individual who technically had this gun violation that was unrelated to the January 6th thing. However, the search warrant in which they discovered the firearm and the ammunition was in fact related. So there is a chance that they can successfully argue in a court of law that this is essentially a fruit of a poisonous tree or fruit of a pardon tree, so that this person can remain out on the streets. But make no mistake about it, it, the reason why he was not able to possess a firearm is because he had a previous violent history, and this is not necessarily a guy that you would trust to be back out on the streets once again, especially since he's shown a propensity to reoffend. Now, to be clear, the reason this guy was unable to possess a firearm, the felony that he was convicted of, was 100% serious. Again, this was actually a domestic violence via strangulation charge that was escalated to the level of a felony, so this is not an individual that you want to be carrying around a firearm, since he's shown a propensity to offend against those that are close to them. And how many times have we seen these kind of people get charged with domestic violence, get released back onto the streets, grab a gun, and end up targeting the person that is, in their mind, responsible for their charges? And the reason why I say in their mind is because if you strangle somebody, if you commit the crime, you are responsible for your own actions. This is something that applies to every single person who commits crimes, whether or not they commit crimes in President Trump's name or not. And honestly, I understand there's going to be a lot of people that are just going to harp on the promises made, promises kept thing, and I understand that for the great majority of the people that were swept up in these January 6th prosecutions, but this is just one example of somebody who threw some kind of explosive device, who is accused of also throwing a broken chair, who is accused of breaking a window, and all these other things that we will never know the result of, that may not only get off specifically on the January 6th stuff, which he's totally cleared of, but if this argument works and it's essentially fruit of a poisonous tree, he might actually get off on this felon in possession of a firearm charge, and that is something that I'm not here for. That's something that I'm not about. Now, of course, they will highlight other individuals who attack police officers. There's a guy who actually stole a baton from a Capitol police officer, ended up hitting that officer, another officer, and it's a total disaster. And these individuals right here are the ones that I would bare minimum not pardon. I would consider maybe clemency, which is mercy, but they still have the conviction attached to them, or I would actually leave in jail, again, depending on the scale of their sentence, because there is an appropriate range for people's sentences for these particular crimes, and it seems like the Black Lives Matter rioters were able to skate completely free, but that doesn't mean we should use that as an excuse to allow other criminals to escape the consequences of their action, in my opinion, especially if you're going to put forward a law and order kind of agenda. Now look, with all that being said, with everybody understanding that this technically was something that was promised by President Trump that he delivered on, even though J.D. Vance tried to publicly walk back those promises just prior to him being sworn in, the fact of the matter is the main issue that President Trump is going to have going forward is that if any of these people reoffend in any serious way, in a way that, by the way, would have conflicted or been undone by their sentence being maintained, that President Trump is going to be tagged with a negative backlash associated with this. But the fact of the matter is that is a risk that you take whenever you do pardons, whenever you do clemency, whenever you do releases of people early. And again, we talked about the Sheldon Johnson case, the guy who showed up on Joe Rogan with Josh Dubin, who ended up a month after that brutally murdering somebody. This guy that Josh Dubin advocated for his release, of course, went to the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, Alvin Bragg. They teamed up to let him out of prison, and that resulted in a murder, and they should be condemned for that, and I do condemn them for that. But the fact of the matter is, we have a very hypocritical media, and almost nobody gives them the condemnation that they deserve for releasing those criminals. But make no mistake about it, as soon as one of these January 6 people, especially the ones with the violent offenses, reoffends, which by the way, out of 1,500 people, the chances of that are pretty high, you're going to see President Trump again experience a backlash from the media that they're just revving up for, that he could have honestly avoided by just examining the cases a little bit more clearly, by again not giving blanket pardons, maybe considering clemency, so at least the seriously violent individuals that were convicted of felonies won't be able to arm themselves and attack other people. Again, if one of these guys goes out and shoots another individual, it's going to be a disaster for President Trump. But I understand why he did this, because this was a promise. I just want to know what you guys think about all this down in the comments below. As per usual, if you like the video, show them by leaving a like, subscribe for more content, follow me on my social media, support me via the support links in the description of this video. This has been me talking about the blanket pardons. Till next time.